He was about to open the envelope that would destroy everything he built. Then his daughter whispered the one truth that even a billionaire couldn't afford to ignore. The envelope lay in the center of Ethan Vale's desk, its cream paper catching the light from the tall windows that lined his study. The room smelled faintly of polished wood, and the faint hum of his computers filled the silence, but his attention was drawn again and again to the envelope. It had no return address, no corporate stamp, only his name written in looping script that seemed too elegant for ordinary business. He reached for it, then stopped, his fingers hovering just above the paper. For a man who had made his fortune in cybersecurity and strategic risk, he found himself strangely uneasy about a simple letter. Victoria noticed. She was always noticing, always standing a little too close, always ready to guide him toward what she believed was best. Dressed in silk that shimmered when she moved, she leaned against the edge of his desk and tapped one manicured finger against the envelope. "You should open it," she said softly, her voice carrying the practiced charm of someone who was used to being obeyed. "It's from someone who knows about the deal you've been working on. They said it was important, something you needed to see right away." Ethan looked at her, at the way her smile was carefully measured, affectionate yet purposeful. He nodded but did not reach for the envelope again. He had learned long ago that timing mattered. In business, in negotiations, in trust. Rushing into things often brought disaster. From the doorway, he heard the faint sound of movement, the soft scuff of a shoe against the polished floor. He turned slightly and saw Sophie, standing half hidden in the shadow of the doorframe. 8 years old, small for her age, her light brown hair tangled from running through the garden earlier that afternoon. She held a stuffed bear against her chest, her eyes wide and unblinking as she watched him. She had always been like that since he adopted her 6 months ago, silent and watchful, as though measuring whether she truly belonged in this house of glass walls and expensive art. He smiled faintly at her, but Sophie didn't smile back. She simply looked from him to the envelope and back again, her lips pressed tight together. Victoria followed his gaze and clapped her hands lightly. "Sophie, sweetheart, you're just in time. Daddy has something important to read. This letter could change everything for him." Sophie didn't move. She stayed in the doorway, her small shoulders stiff, her eyes locked on the envelope as though it were something dangerous. Ethan noticed the way her fingers tightened around the bear, the way she seemed to shrink back even as she stayed rooted in place. There was no sound in the room except the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Ethan cleared his throat, suddenly restless. He could open it now, satisfy Victoria, satisfy his own curiosity. But something in Sophie's gaze gave him pause. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't trust either. It was something else, something deeper, the same quiet alertness he had seen in her eyes the day she moved in. The look of a child who had learned to pay attention because no one else ever had. The envelope sat untouched, waiting, while Ethan tried to decide which voice to listen to, the charming insistence of the woman he was about to marry, or the silent warning in the eyes of the little girl who had never asked him for anything at all. Victoria lingered by the desk, her hand resting lightly on the polished wood, her smile fixed, but her eyes sharp with expectation. She looked every bit the perfect fiancée, elegant and composed, urging Ethan to open the envelope as if the future of his business depended on it. Ethan sat back in his chair, the letter still untouched, his fingers drumming once against the armrest as he tried to silence the unease creeping into his chest. He had faced boardrooms filled with ruthless executives, had outmaneuvered rivals with fortunes bigger than his own, but he had never felt quite so trapped by a simple piece of paper. The silence stretched until the soft sound of small footsteps broke it. Sophie moved closer, stepping away from the shadows of the doorway and into the light of the study. Her stuffed bear dangled from one hand, her other hand clutching the edge of the desk as she leaned in. She looked at the letter with the same seriousness Ethan had seen her use when studying people, the watchful habit she had learned from years of uncertainty in the foster system. Then she lifted her face to his and whispered, barely audible but steady, "Don't read that letter." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water, rippling through the silence and breaking it apart. Ethan blinked, startled not just by the warning, but by the certainty in her small voice. He waited for her to say more, to explain, but Sophie only pressed her lips together and hugged the bear tightly, her wide eyes fixed on him with a plea she couldn't put into longer sentences. Victoria let out a laugh, too quick and too bright, and smoothed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Oh, darling, she's just being dramatic. Children get these strange ideas in their heads. Don't listen to her." She crouched slightly, her tone turning sugary as she addressed Sophie. "Sweetheart, you don't need to worry about grown-up things. This is just business. Nothing for you to be frightened of." But Ethan wasn't so quick to dismiss her. He studied Sophie, the way her shoulders stiffened at Victoria's words, the way her eyes never left the letter, as if it were a snake about to strike. He felt a prickle of unease crawl up the back of his neck, and though he wanted to tell himself it was nothing, that it was just a child's imagination, he couldn't shake the weight of her whisper. "I'll look at it later," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm as he slid the envelope aside. He didn't throw it away, but he didn't open it either. Victoria straightened, her lips pressing into a line before she forced another smile. "Of course," she said smoothly, "but don't wait too long. Timing is everything in business." When she left the room a few minutes later, her heels clicking down the hall, Ethan turned to Sophie. She was still standing close, still watching him, and for a moment he saw not just a child, but someone carrying knowledge she couldn't fully explain. He reached out, resting his hand lightly on her shoulder, and though he said nothing, the whisper echoed in his mind with a force that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The house felt different that evening, as if the walls themselves were listening. Ethan moved through the long marble hallway of his mansion, the glow from the modern chandeliers casting a pale light that only deepened the silence. The art on the walls, canvases he had collected over years of success, no longer brought him pride or comfort. They seemed like strangers staring back at him, heavy with judgment. He passed by the glass cases that held rare artifacts and sculptures, each one insured for more money than most people earned in a lifetime. But none of it felt solid anymore. The home that once represented stability now felt colder, as though some invisible hand had drawn the warmth out of it. Sophie followed him, her small footsteps making no sound on the thick rugs. She stayed close, clutching the stuffed bear she rarely let go of, her eyes moving constantly between Ethan and the spaces around them. She seemed more watchful than usual, her silence pressing on him as heavily as any words. Every so often she would look up at him, as if to remind him without speaking of the whisper she had given him earlier, the warning not to read the letter. Victoria's presence, on the other hand, was impossible to ignore. She drifted from room to room with restless energy, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, her perfume lingering in every corner. She had grown impatient, her tone sharper than it had been that afternoon. At dinner she leaned across the polished oak table, her smile too tight as she reminded Ethan of the envelope. "It's just sitting there," she said, swirling her wine glass with deliberate care. "You can't let an opportunity like this wait. It could change everything." Ethan cut his steak with mechanical precision, his appetite gone, his mind weighed down by the simple rectangle of paper that waited for him in his study. He nodded vaguely at her words, but his thoughts kept circling back to Sophie, who sat quietly at the table, picking at her food and keeping her head lowered. He saw how her fingers tightened around her fork whenever Victoria spoke, how her shoulders tensed as if bracing against something unseen. The meal ended with more silence than conversation, and afterward, Victoria cornered him in the library. She rested her hand on his chest, her voice soft but pressing, coaxing him to finally read what she insisted was vital. "Ethan, you can't ignore this forever," she murmured, tilting her face up toward his. "What are you so afraid of?" Her words might have touched him once, but now he found himself distracted by the memory of Sophie's whisper. The house felt colder with every hour, the security systems humming like restless insects in the background. He thought of how he had built everything with caution, with careful calculation, yet here he stood, hesitant to open one letter. Later that night, as he walked Sophie to her room, she paused at the doorway and looked up at him. Her voice was quiet but steady. "She wants you to open it tonight. Don't." Then she closed the door, leaving him alone in the hallway with the echo of her warning and the growing tension that stretched through the house like a wire ready to snap. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the old clock on the mantel and the low hum of the security system. Ethan sat alone in his study, the glow of the desk lamp falling across the unopened envelope. It lay in front of him like a silent adversary, daring him to break the seal and discover what waited inside. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, his thoughts circling endlessly. All his life, he had trusted evidence, facts, and reason, never whispers or gut feelings. But tonight, reason itself seemed fragile, fraying around the edges of uncertainty. Sophie appeared without a sound, moving the way she often did, quiet as if afraid to disturb the world around her. She carried her bear tucked under one arm, her small figure illuminated by the soft light from the lamp. She climbed onto the chair beside him, her legs dangling far above the floor. For a long time she didn't speak, only studied the envelope as if it might reveal its secrets to her steady gaze. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was low but clear. "I saw her put it there," she said. Ethan turned his head sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Sophie hugged the bear tighter, her lips pressing together before she found the courage to continue. "It wasn't delivered. It didn't come in the mail. Victoria put it in your drawer when she thought no one was watching. Later she brought it out and told you it had arrived." The words settled over him with the weight of iron. He stared at her, trying to decide if she could have misunderstood, if her young mind had confused what she'd seen. But Sophie's eyes, wide and unwavering, held no trace of hesitation. She spoke with the same certainty he had come to recognize, the kind that came not from guessing, but from careful watching. "Are you sure?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded. "I'm sure. I was sitting on the stairs. She didn't see me. She had a key to your desk, and she was smiling, but not like she does when you're around. Different. Like she was winning a game." Ethan's chest tightened. He looked back at the envelope, his mind racing. If Sophie was right, then everything about the letter was a lie. From its elegant script to the story Victoria told about it containing valuable information. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell himself it was nothing but a child's imagination, but Sophie had never lied to him. She rarely spoke at all unless it mattered. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his eyes locked on the envelope. Doubt pressed in from every side. He thought of Victoria's insistence, her charm, her urgency, and how easily he had almost given in. He thought of Sophie's warning, her small voice carrying more truth than all of Victoria's polished words. For the first time in years he did not trust his own judgment. The letter remained unopened, its secret sealed. But already it had begun to unravel something far greater. Victoria stood in the doorway of the study, her figure framed by the warm glow of the chandelier behind her. She wore a silk robe that caught the light with every movement, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders in a way that seemed effortlessly arranged. Her eyes, however, were sharp, studying the desk where the letter still lay untouched. She crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate, until she stood beside Ethan. He had not moved it since the night before. It sat exactly where Sophie had left him, a simple envelope that now carried the weight of every decision he had ever made. "You still haven't opened it," Victoria said softly, though the softness in her voice was polished, not genuine. She reached out, letting her fingers brush the edge of the envelope, as if her touch could coax him into action. "Ethan, you can't keep putting this off. Investors are waiting. This isn't something you can ignore." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He folded his arms across his chest and studied her carefully, not with the affection of a fiancé, but with the eyes of a man who had learned to weigh every detail. Her urgency struck him as too precise, like lines rehearsed before a mirror. He said nothing, and the silence stretched between them. Victoria tilted her head, her smile faint and practiced. I know you, Ethan. You like to think everything through, to control every outcome. But sometimes you need to trust the people who care about you. This letter contains advice from someone with knowledge you don't have, someone who can help you make the right decision about the launch. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her voice dipping lower, as if intimacy would soften the pressure. I just want what's best for you. Her touch lingered, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He thought of Sophie, her small voice whispering with certainty, her wide eyes fixed on him with the kind of honesty that could not be faked. Don't read that letter. The words echoed in his mind, steady and unshakable. Sophie had nothing to gain by warning him, nothing to prove, yet her warning carried more weight than all of Victoria's polished concern. Victoria moved closer, leaning on the desk so that her perfume filled the space around him. If you wait too long, the opportunity could vanish. Timing matters, Ethan. You know that better than anyone. Her tone sharpened, just slightly, betraying a flicker of irritation beneath the surface. What are you waiting for? Do you not trust me? Ethan's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. He let her words fall and linger without answer. He studied her the way he studied contracts, looking for the hidden clause, the detail meant to trip him when he wasn't paying attention. The longer he watched, the more he saw through the performance. The careful choice of words, the mixture of charm and urgency, the suggestion of doubt. It was all too calculated. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost cold. If it's as important as you say, it will still be important tomorrow. Victoria's smile faltered, just for an instant, before she recovered. Of course, she murmured, withdrawing her hand, though her eyes betrayed frustration. She turned toward the door, her robe sweeping around her like a curtain closing on a stage. Ethan leaned back in his chair again, his gaze falling on the envelope. It waited, silent and unyielding, but so did Sophie's warning. He had no proof yet, no evidence beyond a child's whispered words, but for the first time in his life he chose silence over action, waiting instead of rushing forward. The night air outside the mansion was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of roses from the garden. But Ethan hardly noticed as he sat in the dimly lit library, with Sophie curled up in the armchair opposite him. The fire crackled low, casting shifting shadows across the walls, lined with books. He had asked her to sit with him because her silence had grown heavier these past days, her watchful eyes following Victoria with more intensity than ever. Ethan had learned to recognize when Sophie was holding something back, and tonight he gently pressed her, asking if there was more he should know. At first she said nothing, only hugged her bear and stared at the floor. Then, after a long pause, she lifted her gaze and spoke with the same quiet certainty that had unsettled him before. I saw her, Sophie whispered. Her voice was soft but steady, and Ethan leaned forward instinctively, knowing that every word mattered. I saw Victoria at the garden gate. She met a man there, late at night. When you were asleep. Ethan felt his chest tighten, his heartbeat loud in his ears. What do you mean? What man? Sophie swallowed, her small hands clutching the bear tighter. I don't know who he was. He wore a dark coat and kept his hood up, but they were whispering. She gave him something, and he gave her papers. They looked around a lot, like they didn't want anyone to see. She smiled at him, in a way I've never seen her smile at you. The image painted by Sophie's words made Ethan's mind race. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell himself it was the imagination of a child who had seen shadows where there were none. But Sophie did not speak carelessly. She rarely spoke at all, and when she did, it was because she had watched long enough to be sure. Why didn't you tell me before? Ethan asked gently. Her eyes dropped again, and her voice grew even softer. Because I thought you wouldn't believe me. Adults don't believe kids. Not when it's about someone they love. The words cut deeper than Ethan expected. He thought of the letter still waiting on his desk, of Victoria's urgency, of the polished charm that had once disarmed him so easily. He thought of Sophie standing alone at the garden gate, watching something she could not explain, and carrying the weight of it in silence because she feared rejection. His throat tightened as he realized how often she must have lived with doubt and disbelief in her short life. She looked up again, her brown eyes meeting his directly, filled with quiet determination. That letter is not what it seems. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to them. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air, and Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair, his mind spinning. He had spent years building his empire on logic and facts, but now his foundation was shaken by the simple truth spoken by an 8-year-old. He wanted to demand answers from Victoria, to confront her immediately, but Sophie's words warned him of something bigger, something hidden. The letter was no gift. It was a weapon, placed carefully, waiting for him to pick it up and destroy himself. For the first time since the envelope had appeared, Ethan understood that opening it was not a matter of curiosity or business, but of survival. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of the breakfast room, soft and golden, but Ethan felt none of its warmth. The envelope still lay sealed on his desk upstairs, yet its presence weighed on him as though it were chained to his chest. He could not shake Sophie's words from the night before, nor the image of Victoria meeting a stranger at the garden gate. Logic told him to demand answers immediately, but instinct urged patience. For a man who had built his fortune on timing, patience was often the difference between victory and ruin. Josephine entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea as she had done for nearly 3 decades. Her hair was streaked with silver now, but her eyes remained sharp and steady. She had served his parents before him, seen him through his rise, and kept the mansion running with a quiet efficiency that Ethan relied on more than he admitted. She set the tray down and gave him the same look she always did when she sensed something was wrong, a mixture of concern and unspoken wisdom. Ethan waited until Sophie padded into the room, her bear tucked under one arm. She sat at the table, small and serious, and glanced at him as though asking permission. He gave a small nod, and to his surprise, Sophie began to speak. She told Josephine everything in a low voice, her words halting at first, then gathering strength. She spoke of the night at the garden gate, of Victoria passing papers to a stranger, of the smile that didn't belong to love, but to secrets. Ethan watched Josephine's face as she listened, and for once he felt relief. There was no skepticism in her eyes, no dismissal of Sophie's words as childish imagination. Josephine believed her immediately. "I've seen things too," Josephine said after a moment, her tone calm, though her hands tightened on the edge of the table. "Little things. She asks too many questions about your schedule, about the staff, about who comes and goes, and she watches when she thinks no one is looking." Ethan felt a chill pass through him, though the room was bright with sunlight. Josephine's confirmation tightened the knot in his chest. Sophie's warning was no longer just the voice of a child. It was a truth now witnessed by someone who had spent a lifetime reading people, someone who had never failed him. That day, they began to watch Victoria carefully. It was subtle at first, the kind of quiet attention that went unnoticed. Josephine observed her movements in the house, noting when she slipped into the study under the pretense of tidying. Sophie, with her sharp eyes, tracked the way Victoria lingered near locked drawers, or how her smile faltered when she thought no one was watching. Ethan kept his silence, saying nothing of what he suspected, though inside he felt a storm gathering. Every glance, every question, every too perfect word from Victoria became another thread in a web he had not realized was being spun around him. And as the days passed, Ethan understood that the burden of proof no longer rested on Sophie's small shoulders alone. Now it was shared between them. And together they would uncover the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. The study was cloaked in quiet, the kind of silence that presses on the chest and leaves a man alone with his thoughts. Ethan sat at his desk, the envelope resting in the pool of lamplight like a silent challenge. The script on its surface caught the glow, elegant and precise, as if mocking him for hesitating. His fingers brushed against it once, then pulled back, as though the paper itself burned. For years he had built his empire by chasing information, never allowing ignorance to decide his fate. Every deal, every contract, every merger had been won, because he opened the file, read the numbers, studied the details others had overlooked. His instincts as a businessman screamed for him to do the same now, to break the seal and know exactly what lay inside. Yet every time he reached for the envelope, he saw Sophie's eyes. Wide and certain, they held no calculation, no agenda, only truth. She had whispered to him with the conviction of someone who had already been forced to read the world too closely for her age. She had never lied to him, never tried to gain anything by her words, and in that honesty was a weight he could not dismiss. He thought of her standing in the doorway, her small voice steady as she said, "Don't read that letter." That memory pulled his hand back again and again, leaving the envelope unopened. He leaned back in his chair, his mind torn in two. Logic told him he was a fool. Business demanded certainty, and certainty demanded information. How could he risk everything he had built by ignoring the contents of one letter? It could hold opportunity, or warning, or destruction. Not knowing felt unbearable. And yet he knew there were different kinds of destruction, the kind that came from a ruined company, and the kind that came from betraying the trust of the only child who had ever looked at him as more than a wealthy man. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, measuring out the minutes of his hesitation. His father's portrait hung above the fireplace, stern eyes watching him as if to say he was weaker than the man who had come before. Ethan turned away from it, his jaw tight. His father had built fortunes and lost them with cold decisiveness, never once pausing to wonder what a child thought. But Ethan was not only a businessman anymore. He was a father, and the conflict inside him threatened to tear him apart. The letter sat there, simple, quiet, unassuming, but it had become a battlefield. On one side stood the ruthless strategist he had been all his life. On the other stood the man who was slowly learning that trust could not be measured in profits. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of both identities pressing down on him. When he finally looked at the letter again, he whispered to himself, almost like a vow, "Not tonight." He turned out the light, leaving the envelope untouched, and walked toward Sophie's room, each step heavy with the war raging inside him. The mansion seemed to hold its breath at night, the long hallways stretching into shadows, the hum of hidden machines whispering through the silence. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor outside Ethan's office, her small tablet balanced on her knees. The glow from the screen lit her face, softening the worry etched into her young features. She moved her fingers carefully, scrolling through apps that most children her age would never know existed. She had watched Ethan work enough times to recognize the patterns of signals that moved invisibly through the house. What others might overlook, Sophie noticed, and stored away, piecing together puzzles no one believed she could solve. Tonight the puzzle grew darker. A cluster of signals lit up the tablet, stronger and sharper near Ethan's office. Sophie tilted her head, her tangled hair falling across her cheek as she zoomed in. Most of the signals belonged to familiar things: the security cameras, the smart lights, the routers Ethan had installed and encrypted. But there was one that didn't belong. It pulsed faintly, hidden behind layers of interference, tucked away like a whisper among shouts. She frowned, adjusting the settings until it sharpened. There it was, a transmitter, small but deliberate, its frequency steady and secretive. Her stomach knotted as she stared at the blinking dot on her screen. The location was clear, just a few steps from where she sat, near the wall behind Ethan's office. She had walked past that wall countless times without noticing anything unusual, but now she knew there was something hidden there, something that watched or listened. She pressed her lips together, remembering the night at the garden gate, Victoria's smile with the stranger, the envelope that had appeared like a trick. It all seemed connected, a plan larger than a child should ever have to understand, but one she couldn't ignore. She rose to her feet, padding quietly into the office. The mahogany desk loomed in the center, the unopened letter still waiting like a predator dressed in fine paper. Sophie's eyes went to the bookshelf that lined the far wall, to the spot where her tablet showed the signal was strongest. She touched the spines of the books, her small fingers running along leather covers, until she reached the corner. The signal pulsed faster on her screen. Something was there, hidden in the walls, something meant to capture what was private. Ethan entered a moment later, surprised to find her standing by the shelves in her pajamas. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low with fatigue but edged with curiosity. Sophie held out the tablet, the blinking dot displayed clearly. "There's a transmitter here," she said. "It doesn't belong to your system. Someone put it here to watch you, maybe to hear you. The letter isn't just a letter, it's part of this. They want you to open it, and they want to know what happens when you do." Ethan stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The truth was unfolding, not in contracts or boardrooms, but in the quiet warnings of a child who refused to be ignored. Victoria moved through the study like a warm breeze, soft and graceful, her robe trailing just enough to catch his eye. She carried with her the faint scent of roses and vanilla, the perfume she knew he liked. And when she slipped behind his chair, she let her fingers brush the back of his neck as if her touch alone could loosen the tension there. Ethan did not move, though every muscle in his body was taut. The letter still lay on the desk in front of him, a silent wedge between them, and he could feel her eyes on it even when she smiled at him. She leaned close, her lips grazing his temple as she whispered about how much she missed him when he worked too late, how empty the bed felt without him beside her. Her words dripped with tenderness, painting pictures of futures not yet written. She spoke of their wedding as if it were already a memory, describing the flowers she imagined, the music, the vows. She spoke of family dinners and long holidays, of Sophie in a white dress carrying roses down the aisle. Her voice softened as she described how complete their lives would be once they finally tied everything together. Ethan listened, nodding occasionally, but inside he felt the careful structure of her charm. Each word seemed placed not out of love, but strategy, as if she were building a vision so lovely he might forget the unease that pressed on his chest. He knew the rhythm of persuasion, he had used it in boardrooms and negotiations, but here it was wrapped in affection, hidden beneath the illusion of intimacy. Her hand slid down to rest on his arm, her eyes shining as she asked, almost in passing, "Have you read it yet?" The words were light, so casual they might have been an afterthought, but Ethan caught the flicker in her gaze, the spark of hunger, just behind the softness. He turned to look at her fully, and the smile she gave him was perfect, practiced, the kind of smile that could disarm anyone who wanted to believe in it. She tilted her head slightly, her hair falling across one shoulder, her lips parted as if waiting for a kiss. But Ethan saw the question beneath her charm, sharp and insistent. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence stretched, and Victoria filled it with another cascade of promises. She spoke of how much she wanted to build a family with him, how she believed in his brilliance, how proud she was to stand beside him. She painted herself as his partner in every way, as though the future he wanted was possible only through her. But Ethan's thoughts were not on the future she described. His mind returned again and again to Sophie's whisper, the certainty in her small voice, the transmitter hidden in the wall, the shadow of a stranger at the gate. Every tender word Victoria offered sounded too polished, every gesture rehearsed. He felt himself growing colder as she grew warmer, the distance between them hidden only by her charm. When she leaned down and pressed her lips against his cheek, he did not return the gesture. He simply stared at the letter, the firelight flickering against its sealed edge, and understood that the woman holding him with such sweetness was the very same woman tightening a trap around his life. The evening settled heavily over the mansion, the glow from the chandeliers soft against the marble floors, though Ethan felt none of its warmth. He had waited long enough, and as Victoria entered the study carrying a glass of wine, he decided to press her directly. The envelope still lay untouched on his desk, its presence like a shadow between them. He gestured toward it, his voice steady but sharp with intent, and asked the question that had been clawing at him since the day it appeared. "Where did this come from, Victoria?" She didn't flinch, didn't pause even for a heartbeat. Instead, she smiled, the kind of smooth, confident smile she wore when she wanted to reassure him. Her tone flowed easily, polished, and calm. "It was hand-delivered," she said, swirling her wine slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "One of your investors asked me to make sure you got it safely. They wanted you to have the information privately, not through the usual channels. That's why there's no return address." The words slipped out of her so neatly, Ethan almost believed them. Almost. Her answer was crafted, complete, leaving no room for doubt on the surface. She reached for his arm, her voice lowering into concern. "Darling, you've been so tense. This letter could help you. Why are you hesitating?" Ethan studied her carefully, noting the way her smile held steady, the way her eyes shone with practiced sincerity. He said nothing, only nodded faintly as if satisfied. But inside, he felt the unease deepen. There was no hesitation in her answer, no flicker of surprise, and that perfection alone unsettled him. On the staircase just outside the study, Sophie crouched low, hugging her bear tightly. She had heard every word. Her little face tightened, and she shook her head slowly, her hair falling across her eyes. She waited until Victoria's footsteps faded down the hallway, then slipped quietly into the room. Ethan was still at the desk, staring at the letter as though it might come alive. Sophie climbed onto the chair beside him, her small voice steady but filled with quiet certainty. "She's lying," she whispered. "I saw her. She put the letter in your drawer herself." Her words were not dramatic, not frightened, just firm, the way a child speaks when she knows what she saw and will not waver. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his chest. He had doubted her before, wondering if fear or imagination had shaped her warnings, but tonight there was no mistaking the honesty in her eyes. She had nothing to gain, nothing to protect, but the truth. He leaned back, his gaze drifting from Sophie to the letter, then to the doorway where Victoria had just stood. For the first time, he began to see her differently, not as the woman who promised him a future of family and stability, but as someone who might be playing a role far more dangerous. The certainty he had always relied on in business faltered, but Sophie's whisper grounded him. Trust was no longer a matter of choice, it was becoming a matter of survival. The library was cloaked in shadows, the fire reduced to glowing embers, the air heavy with the faint smell of old paper and smoke. Ethan sat alone at the long table, a glass of untouched whiskey at his elbow, and the letter lying in front of him like an accusation. He could not sleep, not with questions gnawing at him, not with Victoria's smooth explanation ringing in his ears. He told himself he was being cautious, that waiting was wise, but the truth was simpler. He was afraid of what he might find inside, and afraid, too, of what opening it might cost him. The soft creak of the door broke the silence, and Sophie slipped into the room, her small frame swallowed by the glow of her nightlight she still carried when she wandered the halls. She patted across the carpet in her bare feet, the stuffed bear clutched to her chest, her eyes solemn in the half-dark. She stopped at the edge of the table, staring at the envelope as if it were a living thing, then lifted her gaze to Ethan. Her voice was quiet but urgent. "Don't read it, please." Ethan exhaled slowly. rubbing the bridge of his nose before looking at her. He had never been a man who sought counsel from anyone, let alone a child. But here she was again, her small voice pressing against the wall of his doubts. "Why, Sophie?" he asked, his tone gentler than he intended. "Why are you so sure? You're only 8. What makes you trust yourself like this?" She climbed into the chair across from him, hugging the bear tight, her feet swinging above the floor. For a moment she didn't answer, as if weighing whether he truly wanted to hear. Then she said, very softly, "Because kids like me have to. We don't get to guess. We don't get second chances." Her eyes flickered toward the firelight, then back to him. "When you're in foster homes, you learn fast. You watch the way adults look at you. Their eyes tell the truth, even when their mouths lie. If you don't pay attention, you get hurt. If you don't trust what you see, you end up somewhere worse." Her words were steady, too steady for someone her age, and Ethan felt something break inside him. He leaned back, staring at her, realizing that this child had lived her short years with more danger and caution than most men in business ever faced. She wasn't speaking from fear or imagination, she was speaking from survival. Her instincts were not a child's game, they were her armor, her shield against the world that had failed her too many times. The whiskey glass remained untouched as Ethan pushed it aside, his gaze fixed on Sophie. For the first time since the letter had appeared, the weight of hesitation lifted. He no longer doubted that she saw more clearly than he did, because her very life had depended on seeing what others missed. He reached across the table, covering her small hand with his. "All right," he said quietly. "I won't read it." The envelope lay between them, still sealed, but its power was gone. What mattered now was the trust that had taken root between them, fragile, yet unshakable. Ethan finally felt certain, not because of the evidence before him, but because of the truth in Sophie's eyes. The morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed low over the city and seemed to warn of storms. Ethan sat at the long dining table, coffee cooling untouched in front of him, while his mind turned over Sophie's late-night words again and again. He had promised her he would not open the letter, and though the weight of it still pulled at him, he felt steadier in that decision. What unsettled him now was the question of what Victoria truly wanted, and whether the trap she had set was already closing around him. It was Josephine who brought the first crack of daylight into the mystery. She entered quietly, her face calm as always, but her eyes carried something sharper, something that made Ethan straighten in his chair. She set a small folder on the table, her movements deliberate, and nodded toward it. "You should see this," she said, her voice firm. Ethan opened the folder and found copies of documents, printed from photographs Josephine had taken herself. The images showed contracts, emails, and financial notes, papers Josephine had discovered hidden in the trunk of Victoria's car when she went to retrieve a bag of groceries the night before. The names on the pages were unmistakable. Apex Holdings, one of Ethan's fiercest rivals, a corporation known for circling companies like vultures until they could pick them apart. The documents were linked directly to Victoria, payments traced to her account, notes that matched dates when she had claimed to be traveling for personal reasons. Ethan's hands tightened on the pages, his jaw clenching as the truth began to take shape. "She's working with them," he said, his voice low, each word heavy. Josephine gave a slow nod. "It's more than that. Look closely at the wording of those papers. They're not just paying her for information, they're preparing to accuse you of selling out your clients." Ethan scanned the pages again, his eyes catching the careful phrasing, the way his name was woven into proposed drafts of communications. The suggestion that he had willingly leaked data to Apex in exchange for personal gain. He felt the chill settle deeper as the realization struck. The letter on his desk was not an opportunity, not a warning, but a weapon. If he opened it, if he so much as acknowledged it, the narrative could be twisted to show that he had been part of a conspiracy all along. It was not just about stealing his work, It was about destroying his name. Sophie had slipped into the room while he read, standing quietly near Josephine, her eyes wide but steady. When Ethan looked up, she whispered, "That's why I told you not to open it. She wanted you to look guilty." The truth of it sank into him like a stone. For years he had fought rivals with strategies and contracts, with numbers and logic. But this was something colder, more personal. Victoria had smiled at him while she wove the net around his life, and he had nearly let himself be caught. He closed the folder, his decision clear. "She thinks I'll fall into her trap," he said quietly, his eyes hardening. "But now we know the plan, and knowing is the only way to fight back." The first light of dawn spilled through the tall windows of the library, painting the room in shades of pale gold and gray. Ethan stood before the fireplace, the sealed envelope heavy in his hand, though it weighed almost nothing. His face was still, his jaw set in quiet determination, as if the long war inside him had finally reached its end. The house was silent, except for the faint crackle of the dying embers, waiting to be fed. Beside him stood Sophie, small and watchful, her bear tucked under her arm. She said nothing, but her presence spoke louder than words. Ethan turned the envelope over once, studying the elegant script that had haunted him for days. It was crafted to look harmless, to look important, but now he knew it for what it was, a piece of bait meant to draw him into ruin. Josephine's discovery still burned in his mind. The proof that Victoria had ties to Apex Holdings, the documents linking her to payments and plans. Everything had been building to this moment, and though his instincts as a businessman still cried out to know the details inside, he chose differently. Sophie watched his every move, her brown eyes unblinking. He glanced at her once and saw no fear, only trust. That trust anchored him in place. He drew in a slow breath, then, without hesitation, lowered the envelope toward the flames. The fire caught quickly, curling the paper as smoke rose in thin wisps. The elegant script blackened and crumbled, the seal splitting with a hiss, and then the whole thing was consumed. Ethan watched until it was gone, nothing left but glowing fragments turning to ash. The door opened just as the last of the letter disappeared into the fire. Victoria stepped inside, her robe tied neatly around her waist, her lips already shaping into the charming smile she wore like a weapon. But the smile froze when she saw the fire, saw Ethan standing tall with Sophie at his side, saw the ashes drifting up the chimney. Her voice faltered as she tried to recover. "Ethan, what have you done?" He turned to face her, his eyes calm, his shoulders squared. "I've ended it," he said simply. Victoria's mask cracked, the warmth in her expression falling away as panic edged into her voice. "That letter was everything. You can't imagine what you've just thrown away." But Ethan only shook his head, the faintest trace of a grim smile tugging at his lips. "I can imagine exactly what I've thrown away," he replied, "and it was never mine to begin with." Victoria's hands clenched at her sides, her practiced composure slipping. For the first time since he had met her, Ethan saw her not as the polished fiancée who had charmed him, but as the woman behind the mask, a woman whose plan had just gone up in smoke before her eyes. Sophie's small hand slipped into his, and he closed his fingers around hers, steady and sure. The fire burned warm at their backs, and the house, which had felt cold for so long, seemed to breathe again. The fire still glowed in the hearth, the faint smell of burned paper drifting through the library as Victoria's heels clicked sharply against the polished floor. Her smile, the one she had worn so easily for months, was gone. In its place was something raw and sharp, anger rising like a storm she could no longer control. She looked at Ethan, her green eyes wide with disbelief, and then at Sophie, who stood close to him, her small hand clasped in his. "You fool!" Victoria spat, her voice trembling with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That letter was the only proof that could have saved you. You've destroyed it, and now you've doomed yourself. When the accusations come, when your enemies strike, you'll have nothing to protect you." Her words tumbled out quickly, without the smooth polish she normally wrapped around every sentence. Ethan didn't flinch. He stood with Sophie by his side, his expression calm in the face of her rage. He had seen men panic in negotiations before, had watched them reveal their weaknesses by talking too much, and now he recognized the same unraveling in her. "If it was proof," he said evenly, "then why did you hide it in my drawer? Why lie about how it arrived? Why pretend it came from an investor?" For the first time, Victoria faltered. Her lips parted as if to form another excuse, but nothing came. Her face tightened, her mask slipping further, desperation clawing through her practiced composure. "Because I wanted to protect you," she said finally, her voice rising too shrill to sound convincing. "I was trying to keep you safe. And now you've ruined everything. You don't understand the forces you're up against." Sophie's eyes stayed locked on Victoria, her voice small but cutting through the tension. "She's lying. I saw her." Victoria's head snapped toward Sophie, her expression twisting. For a heartbeat, anger burned in her eyes at the child who had ruined everything, but she masked it quickly, turning back to Ethan with a trembling smile that no longer convinced. "She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's just a child, Ethan. You can't let her confuse you." "Easy." But Ethan saw it now with perfect clarity. The softness, the tenderness, the careful charm Victoria had used to win his trust. All of it had been a mask, a costume she wore until it no longer served her. And as it fell away, he felt no loss, only relief. Sophie had been right from the beginning, her instincts sharper than his reason, her truth brighter than Victoria's practiced lies. "You've said enough," Ethan said quietly, but the steel in his voice left no room for argument. "This house is not yours. Not anymore. You will leave tonight, and you will not come back." Victoria's face went pale, then flushed with fury. She opened her mouth to argue, but the sight of his steady gaze silenced her. With one last glare at Sophie, she turned on her heel, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the hallway as the front door slammed behind her. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not cold. Ethan looked down at Sophie, whose hand still rested in his, and for the first time he felt certain he had chosen correctly. The mask had slipped, the truth had come out, and the danger had been cast out of his home. The days that followed Victoria's departure were a blur of movement and quiet resolve. Ethan no longer carried the same hesitation that had haunted him before, the doubt that had left him frozen between instinct and truth. The mask was gone, the lies exposed, and now what remained was the work of dismantling everything she had tried to build around him. Josephine stood by his side through it all, steady and composed, her experience and sharp mind proving more valuable than ever. Together they combed through the documents she had found in Victoria's car, cataloging every file, every forged draft, every payment that tied her to Apex Holdings. The evidence grew like a pile of rotten wood, each piece more damning than the last. Federal investigators arrived quietly at first, their presence discreet, so as not to alert those still moving in the shadows. Ethan welcomed them into the study where it had all begun, the envelope now nothing more than ash in the fireplace. He laid out the folder Josephine had prepared, watching as the agents flipped through the photographs, their brows tightening with recognition. It was not the first time they had seen Victoria's name whispered in corporate circles, but this time the proof was undeniable. Apex had been orchestrating a campaign to seize control of Vale Technologies, and Victoria had been their most intimate weapon. The investigators worked methodically, cross-referencing bank transfers, identifying false accounts, and tracing communication lines. Josephine provided a detailed account of the documents she had photographed, and Sophie, though young, was brave enough to describe what she had witnessed at the garden gate. Her words, spoken with calm clarity, impressed even the most skeptical of the agents. Ethan watched her with quiet pride, his chest tightening as he realized how much of this unraveling depended on the courage of an 8-year-old who refused to be silenced. Within days, the plot began to collapse. Subpoenas were issued, bank records seized, and Miles Wren, Ethan's own chief financial officer, was pulled from his corner office in handcuffs. The betrayal cut deep, but the sight of Miles trying and failing to defend himself in front of investigators hardened Ethan's resolve. Victoria's name surfaced next, her accounts frozen, her movements tracked until she was cornered with nowhere to hide. She had been careful for years, but even the most polished deceptions fall apart when the truth is pulled into the light. News spread quickly through the financial world. Reports whispered of espionage, of betrayal at the highest levels, of Apex Holdings facing charges that would cripple their influence for years. Ethan's reputation, which had hung precariously on the edge of ruin, was suddenly strengthened by the revelation that he had been the target, not the traitor. Investors who had grown wary returned with apologies, their confidence renewed by his resilience and his refusal to bow to manipulation. In the quiet moments after the agents left each day, Ethan would find Sophie in the library or the garden, and she would look up at him with that steady gaze that had saved him from his own blindness. He no longer saw her as just a child in his care, but as the truth-teller, who had forced him to listen when no one else could. The deception had collapsed, but in its place something stronger had been built, a bond of trust that could not be shaken. Weeks slipped by like pages turning in a book, and with each one, Ethan felt the weight of betrayal ease from his shoulders. The mansion that once echoed with silence and suspicion began to change, as though the very walls had exhaled after years of holding their breath. Where there had once been cold marble and polished surfaces untouched by life, now there were drawings taped to walls, small bursts of color on the refrigerator, and the sound of Sophie's laughter drifting down the halls. The day of the adoption was quiet, without ceremony or spectacle, just the signing of papers that made official what had already been true in their hearts. Ethan held Sophie's hand as they left the courthouse, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his, and for the first time in years, he felt whole. No deal he had ever signed, no contract worth millions, had carried the weight of this moment. Sophie was his daughter now, not by blood but by choice, and that choice gave him a kind of pride and peace he had never known. When they returned home, Josephine had prepared a simple celebration. The dining table was laid with Sophie's favorite foods, and flowers filled vases along the walls. There was no grand speech, no extravagance, just warmth and a sense of belonging that even the grandest ballrooms of his past could not provide. Sophie's eyes shone as she looked around the room, seeing it not as a house, but as a home, her home. Ethan walked through the halls later that evening, taking in the transformation. The once empty walls of his study now displayed Sophie's sketches, bold crayon lines mixed with childlike imagination. Josephine had added family photos to the mantel, frames holding captured moments of laughter and togetherness. Even the library, once a place of brooding and doubt, now held a corner where Sophie curled up with books, her bear always nearby. The shadow of Victoria's betrayal still lingered in memory, but it no longer controlled the air of the house. Instead, trust filled the spaces she had poisoned, trust that came from the child who had whispered warnings when no one else dared, and from the woman who had served his family with loyalty for decades. Ethan often found himself pausing in the evenings, simply watching Sophie as she worked on her drawings, or listened intently to Josephine's stories. He realized that this simple, unguarded life was the kind of wealth no amount of money could ever buy. One night, Sophie left a drawing on his desk, a picture of the three of them standing hand in hand beneath the wide roof of the mansion. Above their heads, she had drawn a sun, bright and unyielding, its rays spreading across the page. Ethan stared at it for a long time, his throat tightening, then placed it in a frame beside his awards and degrees. It belonged there more than any accolade he had ever earned. The mansion had once been a monument to success, cold and untouchable. Now, it was a home filled with laughter, trust, and the kind of love that is chosen, not bought. The house was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that carried no heaviness, only peace. Ethan sat in his study, the desk lamp spilling a warm circle of light across scattered papers and the glowing screen of his computer. Numbers and contracts filled the screen, reminders of the empire he had built, but his mind was only half on the work. The other half drifted to the laughter that had filled the house earlier, to the sound of Sophie and Josephine baking in the kitchen, their voices carrying down the hall like music. For years the mansion had been nothing but walls, but now it was alive, and that life had begun with a whisper from a little girl who had seen what he could not. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes, when he heard the softest footsteps padding across the floor. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her bear tucked beneath one arm, her hair falling in gentle waves across her face. She did not knock or hesitate, she simply came inside, as if the room had always belonged to her too. She climbed onto the chair beside him, curling up small and comfortable, her presence grounding him more than any deal or achievement ever had. For a while she said nothing, only watched him type, her chin resting on her knees. Then she leaned closer, her voice barely more than a breath, but carrying with it the weight of everything they had lived through. "Don't forget your coffee," she whispered, her lips curving into the smallest smile. Ethan froze, then looked at her, and for a moment, the memory of her earlier whisper returned to him, the one that had saved his life and his company, the one that had unmasked betrayal. Her voice had been small, but it had carried a truth more powerful than any evidence he had ever held in his hands. Tonight, that same voice reminded him that trust, once earned, was the greatest gift he had. He laughed softly, a sound that broke the silence in the warmest way, and shook his head. "You sound just like Josephine," he teased gently, but inside he knew the truth. Sophie was not echoing Josephine's reminders. She was giving him something much more precious. Her whisper was no longer a warning born of fear, it was a gentle act of love, proof that she was no longer afraid to be heard. He reached out and pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her small shoulders as she leaned into him. The papers on his desk, the contracts waiting to be signed, the numbers glowing on the screen all faded into the background. What mattered was here, in the steady warmth of the child who had turned his life upside down and somehow set it right. Ethan looked down at her, her eyelids growing heavy as she nestled against him, and thought that no fortune he had ever earned could compare to this moment. Her small voice, once overlooked, had become the truest sound in his life, a whisper that had changed everything and reminded him of the only wealth that truly mattered. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.